when he's conquered Egypt, like Alexander the Great, those 3 centuries earlier, he's taken to the ancient Egyptian traditional capital city of Memphis, and he's asked to pay homage to the sacred bull that is kept in the temple at Memphis, just as Alexander had done. And Octavian's reply was that he was accustomed to worship gods, not cattle. In other words, he's completely dismissive of ancient Egyptian religion. As far as he's concerned, Egypt is now conquered territory. It's there to be plundered at will by him and his successors. And the story of Roman Egypt is not a very happy one.
This is CBS, Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Professor Toby Wilkinson. His new book, The Last Dynasty, Ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra, is a sweeping presentation of 2 worlds, the Macedonian from Alexander and the Egyptian from the pharaohs. It's a blend that the professor makes a very good case, leaves it too late for Egyptologists and too early for Roman historians. Well, these 300 years tell us everything about the Mediterranean world as Rome was gathering its might before it conquers everything. We begin, however, with Alexander. Alexander conquers the world, but when he gets to Egypt, there are moments where he thinks about why and how he got to be so powerful. Professor, a very good day to you. Thank you very much for this. Congratulations. And we go to Alexander's decision to conquer Gaza before he marched on Egypt. The decision you present is he wanted to show that he was all-powerful, there was no resisting him. And he built up a wall around Gaza, the same Gaza we're talking about today, the same piece of land, the sandy beaches, the Mediterranean, builds up a wall and uses his siege engines and conquers the city. But there's a moment here where Alexander shows he has an imagination. He carries around a copy of Homer, and he knows what happened once they got into the Homeric story of conquering Troy. There was a moment where a decision was made to drag a man to death around the city. Who was it that Alexander perpetrated that on, and why? Why did Alexander become so cruel that he wanted to, the wrath of Achilles? Why did he want to live that scene out? Good evening to you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me on the show. Yeah, isn't it extraordinary how the name Gaza echoes down through the centuries? It was this pivotal moment in Alexander the Great's rise to world domination. And he really knows, Alexander, that Gaza is the gateway to Egypt, but it's more than just the gateway to Egypt. It's also a prize and much fought over city on the Mediterranean coast. And it's been part of the Persian Empire for many years when Alexander arrives from his battles further north. And he decides to make an example of Gaza. And again, this is, something that echoes through the pages of history. He takes the governor of Gaza, a man called Bartis, and decides to make an example of him in the most cruel and most humiliating way. He attaches Bartis to a chariot and has him dragged around the walls of the city until he dies, in excruciating pain and publicly humiliated. This is not a tactic that Alexander the Great has used before in his wars of conquest, but it's designed to send an unequivocal message to the rest of the Persian Empire that here is a great hero, a great warrior king, Alexander, who is going to brook no opposition. He has the wind in his sails. He is conquering everything that lies in his path. And anybody who stands up to him and attempts to resist will be dealt with in the same fashion. So it's a very public moment of, well, we would call it shock and awe. It's those tactics designed to completely crush the morale of the opposition. And it signals really that Alexander has reached a turning point in his life. He's no longer merely a Macedonian ruler and warrior. He's now positioning himself as king of the world.
Did he mean to say, I am Achilles?
Well, I think he was very acutely conscious of the Homeric myths. He saw himself as a king very much in the mold of the Trojan heroes. So, what he did would have resonated with people at the time who were also aware of the Homeric tradition. So, yeah, there are many layers, I think, to Alexander's behavior.
Makes him feel very modern, Professor. Alexander then goes on to make other decisions that are vital and not logical. He's chasing the Persian army. Darius III is his enemy. Come to Egypt, and the Persians have retreated, but he spends 6 months in Egypt. But it's a strange conduct for a conqueror, as he's left other lands. He wants to be accepted by the Egyptian people, and especially by the priests, to recognize the god Ra. But the trip that's very dramatic is the one he takes to Siwa. Why does he go there? What's there for him?
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting period in Alexander's life. Up until now, he has gone from battle to battle, hardly pausing to draw breath, conquering territory after territory. It's only when he gets to Egypt that he stays a while. And as you say, he makes this extraordinary detour way out into the Libyan desert to visit the oasis of Siwa, because there is a temple at Siwa with a world-famous oracle. Alexander has read about this, he's heard about this, and it's an oracle of the god Zeus Ammon. The ancient Egyptians called their supreme god Ammon. The Greeks called their supreme god Zeus. They were regarded as one and the same deity. And at this point, Alexander is starting to think about what it means to be a great hero. And what he wants more than anything else is sort of divine seal of approval for his actions. He wants to be recognized not just as a king or as a warrior, but as a god. Putting it in modern terms, his ego knows no bounds at this point. He is, the great triumphant conqueror, and he now wants to be recognized as a god. So he journeys all of this way out into the Siwa oasis, and he asks the oracle of Zeus Ammon to confirm that he is indeed God-given. He is a god incarnate. And the priests of Zeus Ammon do as is expected of them, and they give him the answer that he's looking for. Given that he's camped outside the temple walls with a whole detachment of soldiers, it's hard to see how the priests could have come up with any other answer. But nonetheless, he is mightily reassured and pleased with their answer, because he's now able to hold his head up, not just in Egypt, a land with an ancient religious tradition, but across the Greek world. He can say, "I'm not just a human figure. I'm a god. I've been sent from the gods to conquer the known world." And it's really a decisive turning point in Alexander's own story.
Before he departs, he appoints governors, Persian and an Egyptian. He recognizes that we're looking at a culture that's been oppressed by the Persians for 20 years. And he wants to be treated as a liberator, even though the Greeks, the Hellenes are going to remain in charge. A detail here, he also identifies where he wants a city built. Did he do this anywhere else? Say, I want a city there?
He did found a number of cities in the lands that he conquered, and they were pretty much all called Alexandria. So again, this was not a man with a modest ego. But there's something very particular about the Alexandria that he founds in Egypt, because although it's in Egypt, it's not looking towards the River Nile, as all other Egyptian cities had done since the beginning of time. It's located on the coast, and it's looking out to sea. It's looking to the Mediterranean world. And he envisions Alexandria by Egypt as being this great new commercial hub, this kind of dynamo of business and trade and intellectual pursuits. And he wants it to draw people from across the Mediterranean world. So it's a very bold new vision for his new city.
The professor provides maps and drawings so you can see that Alexandria, which the Egyptians with great wit called the building site, Rykotis. They never called it Alexandria, it's just the building site. The Greeks show up and they start building this grid layout that looks like a modern grid. It looks like what Washington looked like when it was first laid out in the 18th century. And we sometimes wish New York looked like. So you can find your way around, and there's a natural harbor and all of the advantages of Mediterranean regarding. But we need now to go to the man who's most responsible for the Ptolemies, the man Ptolemy himself, because all the scenes we've just gone through have been watched by a man born in 367, 10 years older than Alexander, but his good friend Ptolemy. The book is The Last Dynasty. It's about Egypt. Too late for the Egyptologists, mostly, not Toby, and too early for the Roman historians who care about Cicero. Not me, because Toby's filled in the bit between. Ptolemy himself is a man who's born with an understanding of the world via the Macedonians. And for reasons having to do with court intrigue, he and Alexander study under Aristotle. Toby, except for the fact that this is history, you can't make this stuff up.
You really can't. I mean, how extraordinary to have had Aristotle as your tutor and to have learnt alongside the future Alexander the Great. I mean, what an extraordinary start in life. And, the thing about Ptolemy the First, and he is the sort of founding figure of the Ptolemaic dynastic, I think he's overlooked by historians, because what he manages to achieve in Egypt is quite remarkable. He's a great general himself. He has served at Alexander's side in many of the great battles. He's also a very learned man. He's a deep thinker. He's a great scholar, and he's also a brilliant strategist. And the rest of Alexander's generals, when they inherit bits of Alexander's empire at his death, they try and go about ruling them as if they're just Greek city-states. Not Ptolemy. He recognizes that Egypt is an ancient culture. It's a very proud civilization. And he brings Egyptians into his government, and he listens to them and he learns from them. And from the outset, he's deliberately trying to blend the Greek culture with the pharaonic Egyptian culture, take the best of both, and create a kind of hybrid culture which will thrive. And he's very far-sighted in that sense. He's quite unlike any other ruler of his time.
It was easy to overlook him when I first started the book, thinking, well, the important stuff's going to come at the end with Cleopatra. Ptolemy is the driver. We need to lay the map out, because it wasn't obvious when he took over that the Egyptian empire was going to be the most prosperous in the Mediterranean. There's Cyrenaica to the west. There's the Seleucid Empire to the northeast. And there's the Fertile Crescent, the pathway back and forth. And then there's the fleet of merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And there's Cyprus. And if I understand correctly, Egypt will include at its height, thanks to 1, 2, and 3 Ptolemy, the Libyan part, Cyrenaica, certainly all of the Nile, and large pieces of what we now regard as Syria, Israel, Jordan, if I understand correctly. And then the surprise to me is they have sovereignty over Cyprus. Is it any larger than that, Toby?
Well, at its height under the second Ptolemy, the Egyptian Empire also includes parts of present-day Turkey, some of the Greek islands of the Aegean, So it's really an empire that stretches right across the eastern half of the Mediterranean and the coastline surrounding it. Cyprus, interestingly, is one of the earliest Ptolemaic conquests, and it remains part of the Ptolemaic Empire really right until the very end. And it's crucial because it's strategically located in the Mediterranean. It's a great trading emporium. It has a bountiful reserves of copper, where the word Cyprus comes from. So it's a very kind of rich jewel in the Ptolemaic crown.
The important detail here, again and again, you work through, Professor, is that Ptolemy I understood he needed to connect to the Egyptian people. They weren't to be treated as servants. And the way he did that was he not only honored their gods, it felt like he entered into them, that he was half Greek and half, what is the language? Demotic? You call it Demotic, the Egyptian language.
Yeah, and he surrounds himself with advisors who are Egyptian as well as Greek, including priests of the ancient Egyptian religion, and he wants to forge this united culture, this united country that draws on all of these different cultural traditions. I mean, had he spoken Latin, he might well have chosen the motto "E pluribus unum" for Ptolemaic Egypt, because he was trying to fashion one out of many, one identity out of many different strands of cultural backgrounds. And he actually creates an entirely new god, the god Serapis, who is shown as a Greek god, as a man with a big bushy beard, rather like Zeus, but is actually drawing from ancient Egyptian religion. And this idea of a new god who can unite both Egyptians and Greeks in his worship is really indicative of Ptolemy the First's way of working.
I'm speaking of the Ptolemaic dynasty. We've only momentarily stopped at one. We're going on, but it's important to remember now, Ptolemy is a genius at putting together an empire. If you're going to build an empire, best study Toby Wilkinson's presentation of how Ptolemy did it, because he could have been regarded as an invader, as an interloper, as an exploiter. None of those things seem to have applied for his time. And part of an important inheritance he gives to his son and his grandson and the whole line of Ptolemies is patience and forbearance before the Egyptian ways. Professor Toby Wilkinson, his book, The Last Dynasty, Ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. Alexander's gone, Ptolemy's gone, and the son, Ptolemy II, arrives. And he doesn't outdo his father, he honors his father. He cares about scholarship, he cares about finishing the building site to turn it into the marvel of the world at the time, Alexandria. And he cares about the gods of the Egyptians, the gods of the Greeks. All of that is important to him. And just to make a note here before we build the library and finish the lighthouse, what drives all of this is an economy that works. And Ptolemy II and again Ptolemy III understand that they need to maximize their production of grain. How did they do that, Professor?
Well, Egypt was already famous in the ancient world as a very fertile country, with a great agricultural potential. But what the Ptolemies do is enhance that by major new irrigation works. So they reclaim a lot of land in the area of the Nile Valley called the Fayum, around a great lake. They install modern irrigation technology for the time, in order to provide even more crops. So grain is not just a commodity. It's not just a way of feeding your population. In the ancient world, grain is wealth. Other countries which have less agricultural potential want Egyptian grain. So grain is one of the means by which the Ptolemies turn Egypt into a fabulously wealthy country.
They bring in what should have agricultural engineers. Cleon is one you give us a profile of. Oh, yes, note on sources. apparently a lot of stuff was buried. And because it's on papyrus and because the culture is, the climate is dry, it's buried. My favorite was they found a lot of scrolls with mummified crocodiles. Do I remember that correctly?
You do. So when people were looking to wrap up mummified animals, they used whatever came to hand, and sometimes that were bits of old papyrus that were just kind of lying around. And so um, now, once we discover these mummies and we're able to take them apart again, we find that sometimes the wrappings are not just pieces of linen, but they're actually documents. They may be legal documents. They may be excerpts of Homer and Pindar and Greek poets, but it's an extraordinary treasure trove.
Yes, it's important to note that the Macedonians, the Greeks, and the Egyptians are obsessive note takers. I mean,
Mm.
and at one point, there's a clerk assigned to a village, and his whole life is recording what happened today, the weather, the crop, the lives of the people, the water, everything has to be recorded. It's a privileged position, but my goodness, you're tied to your work. All right. Now, there is the grain, but then there is the gold. Where is it, and how do they handle it?
Ah, yes. Now, gold is Egypt's other kind of trump card, really, in terms of international commerce. Um, the gold is found in the deserts, so between the Nile River and the Red Sea. There are rocky deserts, and in those deserts there is gold. In them there are hills, and Egypt is very quick under the Ptolemies to exploit these gold reserves. It requires huge efforts in terms of logistics to get out into the desert and mine the gold and then wash it and pan it and process it and bring it back to Egypt. But it's a very well run operation in the Ptolemaic period to extract gold and use it again with the grain to create this extraordinarily wealthy economy.
The lighthouse. It
Mm.
is. It is. That's as modern as at the time anywhere in the world. It's we call it one of the wonders of the world. I'm presuming it was one of the wonders of the Hellenistic world too. How did they build such a tall structure? Did they have to invent the technique?
Yeah, I mean, it still defies belief, really, that this lighthouse was built, hundreds and hundreds of feet high from blocks of stone on a small rocky islet off the coast of Alexandria. Um, we don't really know much about how it was engineered or how they came up with the idea. There would have been probably wooden lighthouses elsewhere in the Mediterranean, but to build this in stone was a big statement. It was a statement that Alexandria was going to be the commercial capital of the Hellenistic world. But it also proclaimed Alexandria to the wider world. It was a symbol of the city that was recognized really hundreds of miles away. I like to think of the Lighthouse of Alexandria being a bit like the Statue of Liberty. It wasn't just a beacon drawing people in, but it was a symbol of the city itself.
And the library. But before we build the library, there is the Mosean, which you say I can just call a museum. And the museum becomes a magnet for the intellect of the whole of the Mediterranean. The man, I mean, you go down the names, Euclid, Archimedes, good heavens. It reminded me of what happened in the early part of the 20th century when Europe darkened with the threat of the Hitlerites, and all the brains went to Britain, and then many of them toured America. It was like that. Were they fleeing things, or did they just hear that they'll be well treated in Alexandria?
I think many of them were fleeing poverty in their homelands, but Alexandria, and the Museum of Alexandria and the library that went with it, these were powerful statements that Egypt wanted to attract the brightest minds from around the world, and it was going to make life really quite comfortable for scholars who made their way to Alexandria. They knew that they would be studying alongside brilliant people from every discipline. They knew that they would be housed and paid and fed well. one thinks of the founding of some of the great American universities likewise as real statements of intent to forge scholarship, and drawing people from across the world. Well, the Ptolemies do this 2,300 years ago.
Yes, the man we should give credit for the idea of the museum is Athene. My note says Athenian Demetrios. Do I have that correct, Professor?
That's correct. Yeah, he had been handpicked really by Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy the First, let's remember, was himself taught by Aristotle. He was a great scholar king, and he wanted not just to be regarded as a great military leader, but also as a kind of Renaissance monarch. He wanted to be renowned for his patronage of the arts and of culture as much as for his success on the battlefield. So he handpicks people from across the Greek-speaking world, brings them to Alexandria, and encourages them to think great thoughts.
As Ptolemy the First lay dying, that was the beginning of the library, which upsets people when you bring this up. So anybody's going to be upset. This is the library part of our conversation, because 400,000 documents eventually. And the man given credit for organizing the library before the Dewey Decimal System is Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first head librarian. And he invented everything.
He did. He's one of those figures from history that you can't quite understand why people haven't heard of him. Zenodotus, he's the first head librarian. He's given the task, which nobody has ever tried before, of cataloging a huge collection of manuscripts. How do you go about it? How do you sort out different scrolls and different subjects and different authors? He basically invents the science of bibliography. He's a great scholar himself, a great collector and interpreter of Homer. But the way he sets about organizing the volumes in the Alexandria Library is one we would be still familiar with today. He organizes them by subject. So you have mathematics over here, you have astronomy here, you have medicine over here, and then within each subject by author. And that's the system that, has stood the test of time.
And if I understand physically how they did it, they would know what was in the scroll. You have to roll it out to get to the end of it, so that they would make marks as you open it, so you could read like an abstract. Is that how they did it?
That's right. Little tickets really attached to the end of the scroll, a bit like the kind of library sticker on the spine of a book that gives you its mark, gives you its number. It was a kind of ready reckoner, so you didn't have to unroll the whole scroll. You could just go along the shelves and say, that's the scroll I'm looking for.
And we have Archimedes, the astronomer, from the Greek colony of we say Syracuse. They pronounced it differently. I'm aware of that. This is the same Syracuse that will bedevil Rome in the future. If reading Toby's book, you're anticipating Rome, but it's not ready yet. And we're going to make a moment here to talk about the wars of this time, because we've presented, the professor presents the Ptolemies as intellectual giants who oversaw a land of milk and honey. All accurate, but at the same time, they're fighting wars north, south, east, and west. The book is The Last Dynasty. Professor Toby Wilkinson. He's an Egyptologist, which is a very specialized form of taking it for a walk in history. And this period is the 300 years before Rome shows up and takes over everything in the Mediterranean. The Macedonians are in the Nile River Valley, and they learn through Ptolemy. Alexander starts it, but Ptolemy and Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III to work with the Egyptians, who have gifts and many gods, and understand the Nile is life-giving. At the same time, they're surrounded by warriors who mean to take control of the bounty that the Egyptian kings, Ptolemies, have produced. And we have the first Syrian war. I lost count how many Syrian wars there are. I think there are 5. We also have a war called the Cremonodian War. And all of this is fought in the third and fourth century BCE. The Punic Wars start in here. Rome gets involved. Rome versus Carthage, Rome versus Macedon, Seleucids versus Egypt. And the Ptolemies managed all this because what of their army? I've presented them as intellectual giants. Were they also very good on the battlefield?
That they were, and the key to Ptolemaic military success is mercenary troops. So Egypt is a very wealthy country from grain and from gold, and part of that wealth is used to buy the services of foreign mercenaries. And again, if you're a young man anywhere in the Greek-speaking world and you want to get rich quick and have a bit of adventure along the way, you know that if you go to Alexandria and enlist in the Ptolemaic army, you'll be well paid. And if you survive your period of active service, you'd also be granted some land when you become a veteran. So it's a pretty good deal for mercenary troops. And with their own strategic genius for leading battles and with all of these mercenary forces, the early Ptolemies made great military gains across the Mediterranean. But, people always want a bit of Egypt because it's such a wealthy country. And so it can never let its guard down because there will always be a neighbor, a rival who wants to conquer Egypt. And really the story of the Ptolemies is a story of constantly fighting for survival against rivals, against aggressors who want to invade Egypt and take its riches for themselves.
I love the arms race of elephants. Now, I don't quite remember the Ptolemy 3 or 2. They've got elephants, so we need them, but they went to a different part of the Eurasian continent. Did the Ptolemies go for the Indian elephants or the African elephants?
Yeah, this is so interesting, isn't it? So think of elephants as the battle tanks of the ancient world. Once they're clothed in armor, they can really just drive forward against any kind of opposition. So the Ptolemies' great rivals, called the Seleucids, in much of what is today the Middle East, they have access to Indian elephants, which are pretty strong and can be trained as kind of battle elephants. The Ptolemies have to make do with African elephants, which are a little bit more flighty on the field of battle. They're harder to train. But you're right. There is this escalating arms race of Indian elephants against African elephants, and who can amass the most elephants in their army. It's a little strange. You couldn't really make it up, but it was in its time the most important arms race in the world.
And the Syrian wars, the Syrian wars, they're also intermarrying at this point as well, sending sisters to marry kings and heirs.
Yeah, there's a real love-hate relationship between the different dynasties of the Hellenistic world. I mean, they're trying to get one up on each other all the time, but they're also intermarrying. So you have, I suppose it's a bit like Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where you have the Kaiser in Germany related to Queen Victoria and King Edward VII in England. They're close relatives, but they're enemies on a kind of international scale. It's a bit like that in the Ptolemaic period. They're married into other royal families, but that doesn't stop them going to war.
The marriages, the wars continue while they're building this empire of great admiration. And I want to say that the decline is about to start, but there's no easy way to explain the decline with 4, 5, and 6. 1, 2, and 3 do such a magnificent job. Is it that no one could touch them, and so they indulged in non-practical pursuits? I'm trying to come up with how the change happens. It's true that many dynasties fall apart, but this one didn't have anybody crashing in on the Nile. It was powerful.
Yeah, I think there are two factors at play to the decline of Ptolemaic power. One is the cost of fighting all these foreign wars. It's a big drain on the economy, and the ordinary Egyptian farmers start to get a little bit aggravated by the constant taxation and taxes being hiked to fund the army and the foreign wars. And that stokes up a lot of resentment amongst the Egyptian population and leads to civil war. But at the same time, one of the disadvantages of monarchy is that you're never quite sure what the next generation will throw up in terms of the king. And after Ptolemies 1, 2, and 3, and to an extent 4, who are quite high achievers, Ptolemy V becomes king when he's still a small boy, a small child. So does Ptolemy VI. And so for a number of generations, you have kings who are just kids. And so the power is really being wielded by others. Factionalism breaks out within the court, people jockeying for position. And as we know, that can be very destabilizing of a government.
A note, Ptolemy IV is young, so he has someone to run the empire for him named Sosabias. And Sosabias and Ptolemy IV, who's a teenager, eventually fight the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE in June. And I was thrilled to realize there was a Battle of Raphia because it's divided on the international border between Gaza and the Sinai. There's the village of Rafah on both sides. On the Gaza side, it's ruins. On the Egyptian side, it's right up against a fence, the border. But to realize that I had been looking all these years at a battle that took place 2,200 years ago that determined the fate of the Macedonian and Egyptian Empire. It's magical, Toby. I can't imagine the archaeology that must be under that sand if they ever stop damaging themselves.
For sure. I mean, both Gaza and Rafah, names that are all too familiar in today. These are places that have been the site of battles for hundreds, thousands of years. And yeah, every civilization that's passed by has left its mark.
It's sand, and underneath is secrets. The book is The Last Dynasty, from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. This is too early in the world of affairs for Egyptologists and too ancient for the world of Roman historians. And the professor has done us the favor of putting this piece together because this will emerge, of course, in Shakespeare in the 16th century, and we're still keen on those dramas, 16th and 16th century and 15th century. All of that will emerge as romance, and there's a great deal of romance ahead. But now we begin the drama of the decline of the Ptolemies. Professor, 4, 5, and 6 are the decline themselves. Each of them were powerful, but they were being hard-pressed to maintain order because the family had pieces that turned on itself. And one of the ways they tried to deal with this, the Ptolemies and their brothers and half-brothers and wives, is that they would marry their sisters or marry their cousins or marry the daughter of a brother. All of that is unacceptable behavior if I understand the Greeks. However, the Egyptians regarded it as normal. Is that correct?
Well, the Egyptians certainly regarded it as something that they were familiar with royal families doing. So back in the pharaonic period, pharaohs did marry their own daughters and their own sisters. I mean, it wasn't commonplace, but it was accepted that kings behaved a bit differently. So it was an acceptable thing for a royal family to do. It was completely taboo in the Greek world. And this is interesting because here we have the Ptolemies, although they're speaking Greek, they're behaving like Egyptians. They're behaving in a way that other Greeks must have kind of rolled their eyes at. They would try to keep it all in the family, but my goodness me, did it lead to some family feuds.
Yes, we have Ptolemy III begins, well, the Battle of Raphia is 217 BCE. And 204, Ptolemy IV dies, and Ptolemy V replaces him. And now the decline of the family's virtue accelerates or decelerates, whatever the correct metaphor is, I want to get as quickly as I can to Cleopatra the First, because this begins. When I'm reading along, Professor, I come to Cleopatra's name. I go, well, now what's going to happen? Because this is Cleopatra the First. Cleopatra meaning glory of her father. Deep irony. She marries Ptolemy the Fifth. Where does she come from? What is her patronage?
So she is a princess of the Seleucid royal house. So these are the Ptolemy's great rivals, descended from another of Alexander the Great's generals. They're ruling over much of what is today the Middle East. And really, this is a dynastic marriage between the king of Egypt, Ptolemy V, and the princess, the heiress of their greatest rival. And she brings the name Cleopatra into the Ptolemaic royal family. She's the first person to bear this name. And she becomes an extraordinarily powerful woman in her own right. And she really sets the scene for future royal women to exercise power. And the name Cleopatra becomes a storied name in history. And Cleopatra the First is really the woman who starts that whole tradition.
Ptolemy the Fifth is challenged by the Syrians. Very hard challenge. A man named Antiochus III. He launches a very successful campaign and grabs big pieces of the coast, the Phoenician coast, what we now regard as Lebanon and Israel, the Phoenician coast. The city of Sidon, he gains Gaza. He wrecks the trading networks. They're hard pressed. Is the Fifth up to fighting back? Because he spends years at war here.
He's not really up to fighting back, and he has to accept not only the loss of a lot of territory, but actually by accepting the hand of Cleopatra the First in marriage, he's also really showing that he's on the back foot. It's Antiochus III who is now calling the shots and marrying off his daughter to cement this alliance. So this is really the beginning of a decline of Ptolemaic power, but it's a really interesting turning point where the women of the family now start exercising real authority.
Yes, Cleopatra turns out to be clever, smart, and taking account of the Egyptians and their gods. She recognizes what Ptolemy V, well, you call him an ill-fated monarch. Let's be generous here. I mean, the conditions are not great for him, given that the orders are coming from his father-in-law. But Cleopatra, you write, is successful in stabilizing the kingdom. How did she do that?
Yeah, I mean, she's very politically astute. So she surrounds herself by good advisors. Not all of Ptolemy V's advisors are equally good. She's also very conscious of Egypt's deep-seated cultural traditions and goes out of her way to recognize those. So she's a very sophisticated operator. And she must also, it's hard to judge this at such a great distance of time, but she must also be a person of great charisma, great personality, able to win people over to her view. And she really ends up more powerful, arguably, than her husband.
Here's where my diagrams break down, Professor. The Fifth marries Cleopatra I. Cleopatra II is the widow of the brother of Ptolemy VI. Do I have that correct?
Yeah. So Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II are brother and sister.
And they're married.
And then after their marriage, Ptolemy VI's younger brother, another Ptolemy, marries Cleopatra II. So she's married successively to two of her brothers. And by the first brother, she has a daughter, Cleopatra III, who then marries her second husband. It all gets rather complicated.
Yes, well, I just wanted to get to Cleopatra III. What a spectacular woman. Does she get attention in history the way she deserves? Because all by herself, she fights everybody.
She really does. She has inherited certainly her mother's genes and her grandmother's genes. She knows that she's the equal, if not the better of any of her male relatives. You know, move over, Ptolemies. This is Cleopatra the Third saying, I know how to rule this country better than any of you. And I'll take on anybody who opposes me. She is quite some person.
This is a period where Rome is getting organized.
Mm.
About the time the Senate is emerging as all powerful, and Rome is watching. I missed the bit where Rome sent an ambassador to Alexandria. What was their relationship at this moment with Cleopatra the second and the third so powerful? I mean, they didn't know their future, but was Rome beseeching Alexandria to pay attention to them? Was it seeking something? Did they have trade?
Yeah, Rome was very interested in Egypt's wealth and in cozying up to Egypt really as a great trading partner. We know that at times Egypt sent grain when there was famine in the Roman world. So they were looking to trade. They were looking to benefit from that trading relationship. I don't think yet Rome had designs on Egypt, but they knew that if they were going to be the rising power, they needed to be in there with Egypt on good terms.
I lose count a little bit. 4, 5, 6, and 7 all get involved here, and even 8. Everybody takes on Cleo the Third. Sometimes she's in Alexandria with an army around her. Sometimes she's fleeing west to Cyrenaica, I believe, or north to Cyprus. Sometimes she's back in charge. What held her up? Is there an explanation for how she took this on? Did she have counselors, generals? Or did she have a population who was loyal to her?
You had all of those things, but I think what shines through the pages of history here is her sheer force of personality. Cleopatra the Third, more so than the first or the second, is really such a force of nature. She is a person to be reckoned with. She has absolute conviction in her own ability to run things. She has all of that confidence that comes from being a member of an ancient dynasty, but also real strategic ability in her own right. If you're going to play fantasy ancient dinner party, then the person you'd really want to meet is Cleopatra the Third. I mean, she would be an interesting dinner companion.
You very carefully say this is the part of the story where you call it neurosis. The Ptolemies were fighting themselves. These battles were all between cousins or sisters or brothers. Was there no one who could step forward and say, stop it? Was it out of control? They seem to have communicated with each other readily.
They did, but I think when you overlay complicated family relationships onto state politics, as Europe discovered to its cost in the early years of the 20th century, the results can be catastrophic. And that's exactly what happens at this time in the Mediterranean world.
And Cleopatra III had a son whom she favored and was maneuvering to make sure he becomes, let's see, between Ptolemy IX and Cleopatra III, there was a peace for a while, but not very long. She wanted her son elevated. I thought that this lady was never going to leave the scene. She was so...
Yeah, she does. She hangs around for a long time, and not content to be going to war with her husband and her mother. She then leaves has these two sons, and she favors one over the other, and that sets up another civil war between two factions of the family, and she's playing them off against each other. Yeah, she's a real piece of work.
We're going to get this story even more complicated, but at least we'll recognize it because we're going to Cleopatra 7. But why I'm spending so much time on 3, I didn't know about her. The professor has solved Cleopatra, the legend. The old saying from Hollywood, when fact replaces the legend, print the legend. The facts are less believable than the legend. So we're going on to Cleopatra. Now that I know that Cleopatra of Roman times has an inheritance that makes sense. The book is The Last Dynasty, Ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. We're now in the 1st century BCE, and Rome is on the scene. We've established the fact that Cleopatra VII, the woman who we know as just Cleopatra, glory of her father, has a progenitor, a legend to live up to. The legend was real, but it's hard to believe here 2,000 years later, Cleopatra III, who fought everybody. But Cleopatra VII, at 18, is suddenly swept into the presence of a man named Caesar. Caesar's come to Egypt. Why? Because the man he was battling for the Roman Civil War, Pompey the Great, is dead in Egypt. And Caesar comes to Egypt mostly because he's looking to conquer. The civil wars are still not entirely extinguished. And then he meets, is she 18, Professor? 18-year-old Cleopatra?
Yeah.
And at this point, he has wives, he has a civil war, he has an army, and he's 55. I can't remember how old he is at the time.
He's in his early 50s, a battle-hardened veteran. She's a young woman in the first sort of flush of youth. It's an unlikely combination, but somehow the chemistry worked. I think it helped that Caesar saw in Cleopatra a way of getting the keys to Egypt and its great wealth. And what did Cleopatra see in Caesar? Well, she saw a powerful protector who would defend her interests against those of other members of her family. So it was kind of a win-win.
I understand, but it's hard. Again, this is another part of your story where if it wasn't history, we'd say you can't make that stuff. I mean, nobody believes this. She wanted to protect her. Did he recognize that she had skills? Did he know about the Cleopatra reputation?
Well, not when they first met. I mean, she was still a young woman. She still had a long way to go and a lot to prove. But he must have known what later Roman authors write about, which is that she had an extraordinary magnetism. She was one of those people who, when she walked into a room, she just owned the room, and everybody kind of listened to what she had to say. She was a great speaker. She was a great intellect, like her forebears in the dynasty. She had a shrewd mind. All of that must have appealed to Caesar. And she, as I said, had the keys to Egypt, and he was pretty keen to get a slice of Egypt and its fabled wealth.
Immediately there are battles, and it's really hard to tell this part, but here's where the library burned. And we're told that it burned as an accident of defending Alexandria from the sea and from the land. Caesar only had, I think, a bare minimum of soldiers with him, and they were holed up in the palace, and they set the ships on fire that were in the harbor. And that fire spread to the library? Is that what happened?
That's exactly right. Yes, they were worried that the ships in the harbor might sort of blockade them where they were holed up in the royal palace. So he had his troops set fire to the ships. There was an onshore wind blowing at the time. The flames spread from the ships onto the harbor and the wharves, and the library and its storerooms were all located there. And before you know it, the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world, 400,000 volumes covering every discipline of academic study, have literally gone up in smoke.
There was a practice of making copies when anybody came to Alexandria and had a book on board. And then they would give the copy to the original owner and keep the original. Those copies are still out there, Professor? We have 30 seconds.
Probably not. they were long gone.
Oh, what a crime to lose that library. The Last Dynasty, Ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. It is 44 BC, and Caesar is dead, assassinated by a cabal. And the battle that will spill out with the triumvirate, the troika of Octavian, and including Octavian, who is the adopted heir of Caesar, Julius Caesar, who at that point when he died was dictator of Rome, the Roman Empire. And the master of the horse for Caesar's armies, Mark Antony. And they are in pursuit of Caesar's killers. However, once that battle is settled, Mark Antony is assigned as a reward by Rome to supervise what was the Egyptian Empire and is now understood by the Romans to be in their possession. And he comes to Egypt to take control. And now a scene that Shakespeare loves, everybody loves, and it turns out it was real. Cleopatra heard that Mark Antony was in Egypt, had arrived in Egypt, and she puts together an opera that we put to music in the 21st century of her first meeting with Mark Antony, the master of the horse, who now has pretensions of being almost royal because he's in partnership with Octavian, who is royal, and that is inherited Caesar's might. Professor, again, this scene is impossible to believe, but it happened. Now, she's had a couple of children by Caesar, and she's not a young woman anymore, not by their standards of Egypt at the time. And yet she totally overwhelms Mark Antony. How did she do that?
She really does. I mean, she deploys really an extraordinary set of skills to woo Mark Antony. She knows that he's a man who, a bit like Alexander the Great, now has pretensions of royalty, perhaps even pretensions of divinity, and she plays into his wishes. She arrives to meet him not in a chariot, not on foot, but in a great gilded boat. And she is dressed up as the goddess Aphrodite, and her attendants are dressed as nymphs and creatures from Greek mythology, and she's being fanned, and there's incense wafting from the ship, and people playing flutes and lyres, and it's this extraordinary tableau, this kind of scene from mythology come alive. And the boat is covered in gold and the sails are of purple cloth. And you can imagine this scene as she makes this grand entrance. And Mark Antony is completely bowled over by this. And it's as if a goddess is coming to greet him. And it creates an immediate chemistry between these two individuals.
Now, this one, I believe, the 55-year-old Caesar and the 18-year-old Cleopatra VII, hard to believe, although they invented that rolled out in a rug story to make us, to make the whole scene more acceptable. There's no reason to believe that rug actually happened. But there have been 2,000 years of drama in between, so people come up with explanations. Mark Antony, I believe, she is now the regent of Italy. How did he regard her? A fallen figure of royalty? Someone he had to make deals with? How did Rome regard her at the time?
So I think Mark Antony, like Julius Caesar before him, sees Cleopatra as holding the keys to Egypt. She's seen off one brother. She's about to see off another brother. And she really is she's the top dog in the Ptolemaic dynasty at this point. So that's why Mark Antony is attracted by her. The Romans, on the other hand, they see Egypt as a very strange country. It's very exotic. It's very odd. It behaves in ways that Rome finds puzzling. The idea that a woman might be the ruler of a country is totally anathema to the Roman way of thinking, and they cast her as a kind of lascivious woman, as a starlet woman, as a seductress. Because they can't get their heads around the idea of a wealthy nation being led by a woman.
Did they know she'd had her sister killed?
Oh, yes. I think they knew that she was quite a political operator. But again, the idea that it wouldn't have been troublesome for the Romans to think of a man killing his brother. But for a woman to have a member of her own family put to death, this was transgressing their idea of how a woman should behave. So it for the Romans as a whole, Cleopatra was a dangerous woman. For Mark Antony, she was an opportunity.
All right, there's one other turn, and it's present in your book. And so I remember reading once upon a time, the Romans were suspicious of Mark Antony after this because he had taken up with a non-Roman woman, a woman associated with cults that were unacceptable in Rome or were suspiciously disloyal. And they found him weakened because of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, they thought he'd gone a bit soft. They thought he'd fallen under Cleopatra's spell. They feared that he was about to proclaim himself king. Rome was still a republic at this point, and there was a very strong republican sentiment. So they thought, they thought that Cleopatra had seduced Mark Antony, and that he had betrayed and abandoned his Roman principles.
And in order to reel him back, because Octavian, who becomes Augustus, we're talking about the young Octavian, heir of Caesar. He adopted him as a son. Caesar didn't have any living sons. And Octavian says the way to solve this is to have him marry my sister Octavia. So they're obliged to marry in 40. But that doesn't work or does work, or Antony seems especially fickle. How did he choose? Rome is telling him you've got to come home, and he ignores them.
He does, and he ignores his Roman wife. She has a pretty hard time with Mark Antony. Why does he throw her off and prefer Cleopatra? Well, he's been given the Eastern Empire, which is a fabulously wealthy territory. And I think he really does start to think of himself as a latter-day Alexander the Great. And he doesn't really want to be recalled back to Republican Rome to just do his duty as an elected official. I think by now he's seen himself as the progenitor of a new dynasty. And Cleopatra is the woman who can be at his side.
Cleopatra is now celebrated as a living Isis, so she's achieved godlike status. Antony will go on march. I think you report that he had 100,000 troops at one point marching into the Parthian Empire in order to revenge the death of Crassus, 20 years before. And he does seem to have gone soft, Professor.
Well, he's not. He certainly has some military setbacks. I mean, he might have been a great, war leader in his earlier days, but when he's facing the Parthian Empire, he suffers massive losses to his armed forces. He constantly has to come back to Cleopatra for more money and more ships and more fighting men. The tide has turned in Mark Antony's fortunes, and he's now not quite the general that he used to be.
Now, if you follow this story through Shakespeare, it all happens within a few years, and in fact takes over a decade. From Caesar's death in 44 until the end in 30 BCE. There's a lot of time for hemming and hawing, but Antony stays loyal to Cleopatra. They have not one child, they had twins at one point, didn't they? They had 3 children together.
Correct. They have 3 children together. And again, I think for Antony, this is, what could be better than Mark Antony, the master of the Eastern Roman Empire, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. They've got 3 children. Between them, they can form this new royal line that will once again, rule most of the known world.
And they have Egypt's riches, which Rome eyes. Is this the volcanoes time, 43 and 42?
It is. We now know through modern science that a great volcanic eruption occurred in Alaska. What its impact was on the Mediterranean was that it cooled the climate. It played havoc with the weather systems. The Nile has a series of very poor floods, which creates famine conditions in Egypt. The cold weather over Europe also affects the Roman troops. And this really starts to destabilize the Egyptian economy.
Octavian understands what must happen. He must take on Antony. and the Egyptians. And when we come back, it's not over until Cleopatra dies. That's the end of the Ptolemies. The book is The Last Dynasty, Ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. Professor Toby Wilkinson is the author. The professor and I first talked many years ago when he did me the favor of marching me through the kingdoms of the pharaohs. Now he's done me the additional favor of connecting Egypt to my favorite topic, was the Roman Empire, how they did it. Well, now I know that a deal of how they did it had to do with the riches of Egypt. But they had to conquer Egypt, or they had to assume Egypt. And how they did that was, well, messy melodrama. What happens now is that Antony and Cleopatra are, well, they're not exactly domestically happy, but they certainly do spend a lot of time together. And we need to make a note here that not all is war and ruin. They have a club. What is it called? The Immeasurables? What do they call their club, Professor?
Yeah, the inimitable livers. So the people who live in a way that is quite extraordinary, and it was a club that was devoted to drinking and to feasting. Uh, it was like a kind of high society drinking club, drinking and dining club. Yeah, they had their fair share of good times in between the battles.
So we should think of them as in tuxedos and slinky dresses with martinis, smoking cigarettes at a club somewhere. That's how it was.
The equivalent in the ancient world, yes, certainly.
And that would have more upset Rome, correct? I mean, Rome would have thought, we've lost him. He's gone wiggy.
That's not the way for a Roman general to behave.
And I wonder if that encouraged, all right, here comes Octavian. And Octavian has a secret. His name is Marcus Agrippa. I don't think Antony's kept up. Marcus Agrippa is the reason they won the Battle of Actium, in addition to the fact that Cleopatra fled in her beautiful yacht. And Marcus Agrippa delivers Octavian to Alexandria. And now the scenes that Shakespeare takes up play themselves out. There is a final battle outside the city between the Romans and Mark Antony's forces, which include Roman legion. But the Roman legion deserts Mark Antony because not only Rome regards Antony as weakened, they do. And Mark Antony now is surrounded. He either commits suicide, or he dies of someone else's hands. I can't remember. What do we know about his death?
Well, it's a bit hazy, but he's certainly in the fog of war, in the heat of battle. He's fatally wounded. Is that by his own sword, recognizing that the game is up? We're not entirely sure, but the outcome is certain, which is that Antony dies in Cleopatra's arms.
Yes. How do they pull it? I'm trying to stage this the way Shakespeare does. Shakespeare has the scene just there. She's weeping over him, or not quite weeping, but like, Antony, what's happened to you? So he waited to die in her arms because he'd been
he seems to be mortally wounded, but wanting to be reunited with Cleopatra at the last, and so he manages to get to where she is located in the city of Alexandria. She's a virtual prisoner at this point, but they haul him up into the building by letting down sheets and garments, and there he expires in the arms of his lover. And it's
so that really happens.
As far as we know, this is what all the historians confirm. So Shakespeare didn't make it up.
That's incredible. Hauled him through, as I recall, there was one window open, otherwise the place was sealed. And her two handmaidens bring him forward to Cleopatra to have him die in her arms. It's incredible that actually happened. But now the decision making. This is a queen. This is a very powerful line. She is the last of the Ptolemies. She's killed all of her siblings. There's nobody to take her place. And she decides not to use her wiles again, because here comes Octavian. He doesn't have a wife that he cares about. Why does she choose not to seduce him and to kill herself?
Well, I think Octavian is a man in a different mold. Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony have had their heads turned by Cleopatra. Octavian shows no signs of going weak. He wants one thing and one thing only, and that is to conquer Egypt. I think she's got the measure of him. She knows that he's a man on a mission. She offers to abdicate, if only he will, spare her life and the life of her son. But no, Octavian refuses even to acknowledge her entreaties. So I think she realizes the game is up, and she has seen what happens to other Roman captives. They generally get paraded in great processions through the streets of Rome, public humiliation. She doesn't want that for herself, and so the only way out of this is to take her own life.
And now, Professor, I turn you into Sherlock Holmes. How did she die? What is the best theory?
Well, one Roman author put it very well. He said the fact of the matter nobody knows, and I'm afraid that's true. It's nice to think, isn't it, that she may have poisoned herself with an asp hidden in a basket of figs. We simply don't know how she died. The matter of her death was all hushed up afterwards. She was far too important a person. Octavian didn't want to antagonize the entire Egyptian population. But that she took her own life, I think, is very clear. This was her only way of securing her reputation and avoiding becoming a Roman captive.
The Ptolemies are gone, not quite. There are cousins who are going to marry, and the name will continue. But I'm most interested to know how the Egyptian people dealt with this. And after she was dead, did the Romans treat them respectfully the way that the Macedonians, the Ptolemies, had? Did the Romans disregard them and treat them as a conquered people and sell them into slavery if they crossed? How were they treated afterward?
Well, I'm afraid not very well. And this is really summed up by Octavian when he's conquered Egypt. Like Alexander the Great, those 3 centuries earlier, he's taken to the ancient Egyptian traditional capital city of Memphis, and he's asked to pay homage to the sacred bull that is kept in the temple at Memphis, just as Alexander had done. And Octavian's reply was that he was accustomed to worship gods, not cattle. In other words, he's completely dismissive of ancient Egyptian religion. As far as he's concerned, Egypt is now conquered territory. It's there to be plundered at will by him and his successors. And the story of Roman Egypt is not a very happy one.
Yes, Egypt will be how they feed the bread and circuses. That comes from Egypt.
It does. Egypt is the bread basket of the Roman Empire after this.
And buying off the mobs in Rome, who now and again objected to the fact that their city was burning all around them. That's Egypt's grain.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, I have a new opinion of my Roman brethren. Okay, the last dynasty, ancient Egypt from Alexander the Great to Cleopatra. It really happened. As dramatic as Toby Wilkinson tells it, I recommend it. If you want to know what Shakespeare used as a source, here it is. This is CBS, Eye on the World. Goodbye to Cleopatra. I'm John Batchelor.